Hey, I'm Chris from Make Everything, and today we're making this giant marquee sign, and we're going to do it as fast as we possibly can. Check it out. All right, a little bit of context here. So, this is a rush job. I only have about 3 days to accomplish this, and it is completely designed by someone else. So I am 100% relying on their shop drawings. I gave my input in terms of the way it mechanically should go together and stuff like that. But the way that I like to start a project like this is actually with a full-scale print. So I went over to my local Staples and I gave them the drawings, and they printed them out on their plotter as though they would print out a banner. Now, something like that is going to allow me to lay that out on plywood and then cut it out directly, since I can't cut these on the CNC. The letters are just too big. So let's get started. Okay, so something that's important when you're doing work like this and you're going to be printing off of a scale. I didn't do this vector drawing, the designer did, but I had him add a 2" by 2" square that would allow me to know that the print was 100% accurate when I got it back. By having this as a reference, I can go back now and check and know that this square is measuring out accurately at 2 by 2. There is another component to this that is some acrylic mirror that's going to be laid in this, and since I'm not doing it, me and the mirror guy need to be working off the same drawing. So now that I know that this is the scale, I'll cut out these letters, get them on the MDF, and start cutting them on the bandsaw. Alrighty, so getting into this project, like I said in the beginning, we only had 1 full day and 3 evenings. Now, I brought in 2 guys to help me out with this project, Matt and his brother Nick, and we all work full-time jobs. So to get this done in the time required a lot of coordination and a lot of really hard work. So to get started, I cut out that full-scale drawing, and then I started laying it out on the MDF that I'm going to be cutting the letters out of. The design was a little loose in terms of, how they could be built. These marquee letters are going to be wrapped in a 16 gauge cold rolled mild steel. So what we decided to do was sort of a 3-layer MDF sandwich to give a nice solid substrate for that sheet metal to be attached to. Another key piece of information regarding these letters is that they don't want to see any visible fasteners. So everything is going to need to be attached to the MDF with a washer that's welded inside the steel, and everything's going to have to be blended and screwed down. So to start, I'm using a 3/4 inch ultralight MDF, and I'm just spray bonding down the letters that I got printed. And now, like I said earlier, these are 100% full scale, and I can go ahead and basically mark these out on the MDF and then cut them out using the bandsaw. It's going to be very, very important that I keep these letters accurate because, like I said, these are getting an acrylic mirror element that's going to be inlaid in them after the fact. Now, the mirror is going to be laser cut, but since we're on such a tight deadline, the mirror actually doesn't exist at this point while I'm doing this work. So I'm really reliant on cutting close to the line and taking my time so that when that mirror comes, it fits perfect. I did have the mirror undersized by 1/16 of an inch all around, basically a 1/16 inch offset. So it gave me a little bit of room, but for the most part, I just set my blade tension on my bandsaw really tight and made sure that I had a nice fresh blade on there and cut right on that line. I was, really, really super careful with it. Unfortunately, there is, a little bit of a limitation in the throat of my bandsaw, so a lot of the stuff had to be recut with a jigsaw, but the bandsaw I've found is the most accurate way to do this kind of work, so I did as much as I possibly could using that. You can see where I kind of reached that limitation using the E, trying to get in there. So I'll switch over to my jigsaw, and again, I'm taking extreme care to make sure that my cut is right on that line. Just making sure that, I don't waver, and watch that blade, keep the pressure on the jigsaw actually relatively light because I don't want to create any side load. That's a big problem with jigsaws, is the blades kind of kick out to the side. So I'm just being super careful and using a fine-tooth blade to make sure that I get these cuts extremely accurate. Now, the process of making these letters is basically the same for all 6 of them, so I'm not going to bore you with showing me making every one of these letters from start to finish. But my concept here was that if I could get a really nice reference letter for that top layer, I could then make the second layer using just a router to blaze through it with a pattern bit, and that would just make the whole process a lot faster. So once I had the first layer of the letter built, I then screwed it together to MDF, and then I routed them all out. All right, so the marquee letters get a steel wrap around the outside. This is 16 gauge mild steel. This is cold rolled steel, so it's very clean, but the client wants what's called a brushed finish. So the way you accomplish that is with a surface conditioning tool like this. This is using 120 grit Scotch-Brite, and basically we're just gonna brush this so it has a uniform striated line in it. It's a lot easier to do than polishing, and it's gonna get out any of these scratches from the mill. Because of the timeline on this project, I'm going to hand this over to Nick, who is going to prep all these while I finish the letters. So Nicholas spent basically 2 full days Scotch-Briting all these pieces of metal. He did an incredible job. He's got a really great eye for detail, and I was very thankful to have him on this project. While he was doing that, I took some leftover MDF and I ripped it into 2-inch strips. And using those strips, I was able to create sort of a third layer for the letters themselves. I didn't want this to be overly heavy and use 3 full layers of MDF, so this sort of skeletal frame will give us enough structure and also a little bit more depth on the letter so that that metal has a really nice reference surface against the side. I'm using glue and 1.25" brad nails just to secure everything, and I'm making sure with these little blocks that my letters are nice and square, the first layer and the back layer, so there's no offset. Everything got glued and nailed together. Once I had all those letters done, it was time to start on the frame that goes around the entire sign. Now you see how I sort of converted my wood shop to a metal shop for this part, and I brought in my metal cutting bandsaw and I started cutting out my 45s for the perimeter of the frame. For the frame, I'm using 16th wall 1x1 cold rolled mild steel tubing. The cold rolled aspect of it is important because I'm going for a clean surface finish on this, so I wanted it to be as easy as possible. On the table, I put a just regular sheet of sheet metal so that I would have a substrate to not burn my table as much. But, I really don't have any issues about welding in my wood shop. We were very aware of the sparks and, made sure that we had a fire extinguisher around. And you can see I put a welding blanket over my planer and drum sander just to minimize things. So I'm just checking for square, making sure that all my angles, everything is correct. This is a pretty big surface on a pretty big sign frame. It's about 102 inches wide by 60 inches tall. So I want to make sure it stays nice and square. It also has this nice detail in these 1/4-inch round rods that make an X in the back of each of these 2 panels that are separated by that central divider. So I take care to put these in, and then the center area gets one of the rods cut so that they look like they continue through each other. So I make sure that those are welded and blended really nicely so that they look nice and continuous. I also wanted to be sure to keep these nice and tight so they look taut and sort of suspended in there like a cable. Now this process took a while. It was a lot of up and down off the table, moving around trying to get everything welded and blended, making sure everything stayed square. It was a ton of work just to make this frame. Now while I'm doing this, my friend Matt is in the other room bending up the sheet metal for the letters. Each of the letters took several hours just to bend the sheet metal and properly get all the seams blended. So it was great to have, sort of a team working on this.
Nick prepping material, Matt bending up the sheet metal, and me in this room building up the frame so that we could accomplish this job on time. And every once in a while, Nicholas would come in and help me, or Matt would come in and help me, move stuff around. So it was great to, have 3 people in the shop instead of just me working on something like this. So once the base layer of the frame was done, I worked on the upper layer, and I just made sure to reference off that base layer to keep everything nice and square. And again, just welding and blending everything, being careful not to burn through this 16th wall tubing, which is pretty easy since it's so thin. And then the whole frame got some dimension by way of these 6-inch tubes that would basically bring the frame up, and then also allow me to put some support bars across the back to hold the letters. Now, when you're doing this kind of work, it's really easy to get proper spacing using wooden blocks. So you'll see in a second, after I get everything tacked together, I'll start cutting up some pieces of 2x4 and I'll use those as a spacer to properly align all the posts and get everything built exactly how it is on the drawing. A lot of people have reservations about using wooden spacers when they're doing welding projects. They think they're gonna, immediately go up in flames. It takes a lot to light a piece of wood on fire when you're welding next to it. I actually really prefer to use wooden blocks because you can't accidentally weld them to your work. So I'm using a little wooden spacer block, which is gonna make sure that on all 4 of my corners, I have perfect spacing throughout the piece. And the symmetry of this is very important because the frame is actually part of the art piece itself. So I want to make sure that everything is really accurate and exactly how it is on the shop drawings that I was given. Like I said in the beginning, I didn't design this. I'm building this for an art fabricating company. I'm basically acting as a subcontractor here. So this piece was designed by a professional artist and then rendered by my friend Eric, who owns the company. And then we were brought in to make it a reality. Now you can get an idea of sort of the teamwork that was going on through the project here. I'm now grinding the frame and all my welds down, and you can see on the right, Matt is getting ready to put the sheet metal on this letter. The sheet metal was supposed to be 4.5 inches from the face of the MDF. So an easy way to accomplish that was by hot gluing some 2x4 spacers to the MDF and then doing all of the work face down. So Matt has to measure and bend up all the corners of this material and get everything really, really tight so that everything looks continuous and the mirror sits nicely in it. While he's doing that, I'm going to be working on the vise, making up about 25 brackets that will be used to hold the letters to the frame when the whole project is complete. So working in tandem like this, and then behind me, Nicholas is doing the finish work on a couple of the other letters that are already done. So I'm using the vise to just bend over that metal and cut it with the bandsaw, while Matt uses the brake and a hammer and these 2 posts that he welded into the tabletop to properly bend the sheet metal around this. The 16 gauge sheet metal was definitely overkill for this type of project. The client wanted something that was going to look substantial, but honestly the 16 gauge made it a little problematic to do the fine detail work that we were going for on this. So it was a little bit of extra work. In the end, the finished product really came out really well. I'm really happy with it. So, Matt using the brake and just sort of doing a lot of it by hand and by eye, using a lot of clamps along the way to get everything super tight. The fastening system that we came up with on this was to use a non-coated washer, basically a raw steel washer, and weld it inside the sheet metal wrap on the back side of the letter, and then fasten it with a 3/4 inch screw. Now what this allowed us to do was it allowed us to fasten the metal really well to the MDF, but not have to worry about any fasteners on the outside of the metal because the client really didn't want to see those. In the end, it turned into a really, really nice seamless look, and it was absolutely worth the time and energy to get those washers welded on there. So you can see Matt here going through the process of clamping it up and welding the washers on as he puts in screws. It's a very on and off process. He has to weld in washers, put in screws, mark the bends, and then take the entire thing apart again to get it back onto the brake and bend up more corners. This was extremely labor intensive, and I can't thank Matt enough for coming through and helping out on this project. There is absolutely no way that we couldn't have done this without him and Nick coming in. Matt's an incredible fabricator, and I'm going to talk more about the work that he does at the end of the video. He's bending all this stuff up, basically just using the marks that he's drawing as he's going through the letter. Nothing is really regular enough to do anything too far in advance, so it's all about just taking it apart, putting it back together, and making sure it's as tight and perfect as it possibly can. Again, we had to do this for all 6 of the letters, so you can imagine how much work that was, but we're really just going to show this one letter so that we can get this video moving. Now, since the letters required so much sheet metal to get around them and we only had 8-foot long rips, we did have to weld some seams in on a couple of the letters. So the way that we did it was Matt would get all the letters bent to a point where we could have a nice straight piece of material, and then he would cut off the sheet metal using the grinder and then weld another piece to connect the corners that were missing. So for the welding on those pieces, he TIG welded everything to get a really nice fine bead and make sure that there wasn't any extra material that absolutely needed to be there. And that worked out really well. It gave us really nice corners, and it was really easy for us to clean up. So he tack welded that in place and then cuts it off with the grinder. And once that's cut off, he can go back in with the TIG welder and really finish up those corners so that Nicholas can go back with the Scotch-Brite and blend it all together so it looks like it was all one continuous piece of metal. Now, with each of the letters being finished, we would then have to go back and grind off all the weld spots from where the washers were welded on. So we were going in with a 320 grit sanding pad on the angle grinder and a soft back pad from Benchmark Abrasives, and that was allowing us to get those weld spots off. And then we were going back with the Scotch-Brite that we used to originally condition the steel and give it that continuous brush look throughout. I did a couple of the letters, but really most of this was done by Nick. He has a great eye for detail, and he was able to get into all the nooks and crannies on both the insides of the letters and the outsides of the letters and get everything really well cleaned up. It was a pretty long process. You can imagine that every letter had to have the same level of finish, so we had to go through and really put a lot of time into cleaning up the weld marks, making sure there weren't any scratches or marks from the brake, and get everything to, that consistent look so that they look like they all were kind of pressed like cookie cutters. So Nicholas spent a lot of time hand Scotch-Briting them or sanding them with 320 grit paper to get all the weld marks out, make sure everything looked great. You can see here how some of the areas we can't get to with the surface conditioning tool at all because they're just too tight, like the inside of the bottom of the end. So all that stuff had to be Scotch-Brited by hand. But with the 120 grit pad on that surface conditioning tool, you can actually blend into that using a red Scotch-Brite pad, and it's actually really difficult to perceive the difference between the roller wheel and the hand done stuff. So that was a really nice little surprise that we came up with while we were working on this. Now with that stuff done, we could start to polyurethane the letters sort of as they were being finished. And also the frame would get a complete 2 coats of poly as well. So what we used here was a satin wipe-on poly, and it really just kind of preserves the luster of the brushed metal. It doesn't add anything to it. It makes it a tiny bit darker, but it doesn't haze up, and that's the big key there. So since this is a raw steel, this stuff would have a tendency to flash rust, and this whole piece is actually being created and shipped to Los Angeles, so we wanted to make sure we didn't have to worry about any environmental factors rusting up these letters that we spent so much time finishing. And then after that was done, the acrylic mirror could be installed. So I'm using a 3M Spray 90 on both the back of the mirror and the inside of the letter, and dropping in the laser cut mirrors, and I was happy to see that all the laser cut mirrors fit perfectly based on the letters that I cut out. We peeled the plastic off of this one just to see how it looked, but for the rest of the mirrors, we'll leave the plastic on just to make sure they stay nice and protected. With all the letters done, we're able to do the layout on the final sign setup. Now, the layout was very specific. I was able to get all of that information from the designer, which was really helpful. And what we found the best way to do this as was to take all the letters and lay them face down on the big table, and then do all the layout in sort of a mirrored fashion. Now, what this allowed us to do was then take the frame and lay it on the back, and then using those brackets I bent up using the vise, attach everything to the frame exactly where it needed to be, and not really have to do any positioning once everything was assembled. The entire sign was very heavy. It was a little over 300 pounds, so we really didn't want to have to mess with it once it was put together. We wanted to basically weld these brackets in place, screw them in, and be done with it.
I think it's good. I didn't go over the racks.
We're good. I looked at them.
It's alright, I will.
All right, folks. It's the moment of truth. We're standing this up. All right, ready? 1, 2, 3. Full cable move. Thanks, Lloyd. Oh, shit. Ah. Welcome to the end, my friend.
Overall, this project almost killed us, but we were able to get it done. Again, I can't thank Matt and Nick enough for coming in. You know, we all work during the day, so to come in and do this at night and stay till 2 a.m. was really a feat, but I'm really happy with how the whole thing came out. And with the neon installed, it just looks fantastic. The neon was installed by Eric. It was made by a third party, but you can see it here all assembled, and all together the piece really stands out. I'm really happy with how it came out. I can't wait to make more.
All right, that about does it for this video. This was a massive undertaking. I honestly cannot believe that we got it done in the timeline that we had. Thanks so much again to Matt and Nick for coming in and staying with me till 2 a.m., really pushing hard to get all this metal bent up and finished. The neon came out amazing. Eric did a fantastic job installing all of that. Go ahead and check out Eric and Serena's shop, Shisanwu. They're the ones that got me involved with this project. They do a lot of fine art fabricating, and they make a lot of really incredible work. This piece in itself is going to be used and sold for a charity auction. All the details for that will be down below in the description. You should definitely check it out. It's for a great cause. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you have questions, leave them down below. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at MakeEverythingShop. Check out Matt and Nick and Matt's shop, Yard Rats Fab, where he makes amazing motorcycle stuff, custom built frames from scratch, and he's a really talented metal worker. So again, I hope you enjoyed it. Like it, share it, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more stuff like this, and I hope to see you on the next video. Thanks. This is the end.